let me get this right. Hopefully, Alan don't kill me. Alan is the co-founder of Forestwalk Labs, where he's building products that help teams ship faster. Previously, he was a software engineer at Apple, co-founder of Steamclock Software, and in 2009, he founded VanJS. Today, Alan is walking us through the JavaScript framework's State of the Union. Fatigue strikes back. Please welcome Alan to the stage.
All right, thanks, Bibi. I am indeed Alan Pike. So today I'd like to tell a little story about JavaScript. So I've been a web developer since before it was cool. It's been a while building stuff for the web, and of course therefore using JavaScript. And as has been mentioned, back in 2009, I thought it would be really helpful to talk to some of the other folks that are also building for the web, writing JavaScript, pushing the boundaries of what the web can do. So I started a little thing called VanJS, and it is so wonderful to see 15, 16 years later, it's still happening, it's growing, it's thriving. So thank you so much to Bibi and Sean and everyone else who has kept that tradition rolling. So thank you so much. Yeah. Since then, I've gone on a little bit of a different journey. I founded a studio called Steamclock, where we build products for other startups, building with JavaScript, yes, but also mobile apps. And in doing that, I started to spend my time doing things like hiring people and doing design and managing a team and learning about how to grow a company and all that stuff. And that was great, and I learned a lot. But it took me away from the building of things. And so last year, I co-founded a new business called Forestwalk, and we're building tools for teams. I'm not here to talk about that, though. The reason why it's relevant to this is that I'm back building. I'm writing code every day, talk to customers, write code in a loop. And every day I'm writing in JavaScript or TypeScript specifically. And it has been so fun to see how the platform has gotten so much better in the last 5 or 10 years. Like on an hourly basis, sometimes it can be very fatiguing seeing, oh, there's another JavaScript thing, there's another thing I'm supposed to learn. But to actually come back and see how much better things are has been really great. So I'll just give some examples. And so the platform itself has gotten way better. Right, so in the last 5 or 10 years, like async and wait and ES modules and some of these things that were like kind of experimental in the past are now just well supported. They're in the browser, they're in Node. You can share code in between those two environments, and it's not like some complete science project. It just like the code runs, and it's really delightful. We have the View Transitions API, which is relatively new, but in the browser, we can now have more app-like experiences where you have things, arguments previously, people had said, oh, you have to have a native app to have this transition. Now it's like, it can literally just be a different URL, and it just like transitions nicely. And so these sort of platform features, and then async await ES modules and fetch is another one of those examples of just these APIs that are more modern, they're consistent across different platforms, and just make it a lot easier and nicer to build things on the web today with JavaScript. So the platform itself, these are just a few examples, has gotten a lot better. The tooling has gotten even more, there's been even bigger change. So if we look at like the tools around like how we do our builds, we got things like TypeScript, which I mentioned. 10 years ago, it was like this weird experiment. Now it's extremely well supported. It's robust. It's well understood. Not everyone loves it. I like it, but it's way a better place now if you're using it today than it was 10 years ago. And all these other tools around, like things like PNPM, which solves a lot of the kind of just like pain and suffering of some of the tooling that we've had in the JavaScript world for a long time, and also better testing tools, things like Playwright and vtest that allow. With vtest, you can just have your tests running. You change a file, and then the tests immediately run on the things that you change, and then right away, as opposed to like, oh, I guess I should run the test before. Oh, I've been breaking stuff for the last 2 hours. And so just seeing all these tools and catching up on all of them has been really fun. I'm having to click for it twice for every click. The rise of serverless has also been really awesome to see. 5 or 10 years ago, certainly 10 years ago, serverless was more like kind of like a curious, like, oh man, like that's an interesting, is that really going to work? And sort of maybe people thought of it as a niche use case, and now it's very mainstream. It's a really common way that people are deploying applications. We've seen the rise of Lambda, obviously, but Vercel, which Luca mentioned, and for love or hate them, they've really raised the bar in terms of what kind of developer experience and UI people now see in our, or might expect in our developer consoles and things like that. So that's been really fun to see all that. And then there's also the rise of LLM-powered tools, which is kind of the most recent development, which of course is causing some problems. Like if you're trying to build a JavaScript app based on some really bleeding edge library that the LLM wasn't trained on, like then you're going to have a harder time now. But if you're building something with tools that are well understood, then you're going to be moving way faster, especially if you're doing like real kind of monotonous work, like refactoring. You change a dependency, and now a whole bunch of stuff in your code base needs to change in this kind of mechanical way. These tools make that kind of work way faster. And even just building a brand new app, especially if you're building an app that's using well understood tools, it's like way faster now. And so it's really cool to see the improvements that we've seen in the platform. One of the things I would not have predicted 10 years ago is that there's a little library that was kind of like quirky and weird called React. I'm sure you've heard of this. When it got announced, it's like virtual DOM, like, is this really going to be a thing? And yeah, it turns out it became a thing. It became a thing that like pushed all the other things a little bit to the sides, and like the gravity of React just kind of like sucks in everything else. Everything is like in relation to React. Even on Node, people working in Node, they still are now starting to get React-based changes and things like that. And so this has been one of the other kind of big changes, and it's been interesting to see. And even though like, I wouldn't say I'm like the world's biggest fan of React, it's been cool to see the JavaScript community actually kind of agree on something for a little while. They're starting to not agree on it anymore, but there was like a while where the JavaScript community agreed on something. So there's been a lot of things that have changed over this 10 years, and most of it has been good. But there's one thing that has not changed, which is that there are too many frameworks, like just way too many, and there's just always more, and it doesn't stop. And that was true 10 years ago, and that is true today. And this is where the fatigue comes in. 10 years ago, I wrote an article about JavaScript framework fatigue and predicting like maybe it would finally be done because this React thing seemed like maybe it would be something. And it was something, but also now there's like 99 more frameworks that add to it and things like that. And so this is something that 10 years ago I thought, okay, well, how are we going to, this has to stop. It's madness. JavaScript developers have no discipline. Why are they always creating new frameworks? But something that I've come to understand is it's actually fundamental to the platform that there is actually this evolutionary pressure to have more frameworks. So when we think about JavaScript as a platform compared to other platforms, it's universal. Everybody interacts with JavaScript. If you're building for the by far most popular platform of all time, which is the web, then you're using JavaScript because that's the language that runs in the browser or something that compiles to it. And so because of that, everybody who's everybody from every background with every problem domain who comes from any other language that has its own ideas about how to do things all write JavaScript. And so there's this huge diversity, which is mostly a good thing, but it creates this extra complexity in the ecosystem. There's less consistency in between from one JavaScript developer to another, which again, it's mostly good, but it creates more frameworks. Second, oh no, I may be losing my battery. That's what's happening with this. I'll go here. Okay, well, I'm just gonna stumble through this and it's gonna be slightly embarrassing. You're all gonna be on a wonderful journey with me. Yeah! Yes. So actually, I'm gonna admit something here. I've given many talks and I always use Keynote, and this time I was like, let's use Figma slides. I didn't want to have to say that. It's not their fault. It's not JavaScript's fault. It's probably JavaScript's fault. So these are the three things anyway. So the universality of the platform. There's the fact that the platform changes really rapidly. So normally when you build frameworks on a platform, the language, it's consistent. The platform is built on, it's consistent. If you're writing Rails, it's built on Ruby. Ruby doesn't change very rapidly. Ruby is built on the operating system. That doesn't change very rapidly. But if you're writing a JavaScript framework, that's built in the browser. And the browser itself changes more rapidly than the operating system, APIs or POSIX or something like that. And so there's often motivations for the language and the frameworks that are built on it to change. And then there's also the execution model. So the execution model of the browser, obviously, this is different for Node, but for the browser code, it has to be sent to the end user in order for it to execute. That's the way that the browsers work. And that means that there's an evolutionary pressure on JavaScript frameworks to be small, which means that they don't just like get more and more featureful like something like Rails, that just they add and add and add to it, that it actually devolves over time to the point where it's like, oh, this is too slow, we should start again afresh and just have a new framework that only does the modern approaches and jettisons all the old stuff. And that's actually like a more reasonable decision in the execution model of the browser, where you might actually need to be concerned with how large of a bundle you're sending to the browser. So these things all create this pressure on the frameworks to always have a sort of, unfortunately, for better or for worse, have an increased number of frameworks over time. This is the execution model. So thinking a little bit more about the execution model, this is the execution model, back when I said I was a web developer before it was cool, that we used to have in the browser. It's like what I would call a traditional server-side rendering, PHP app or Rails app, where the server would render most of the stuff. It would create a bunch of HTML, and then it would send it over to the client, and the client would have maybe a little bit of JavaScript, sprinkle on some enhancements. In the last 5 or 10 years, we've had a lot more apps that are built in an inverted way, where we have the majority of the complexity is on the client side. And so we have the rendering and the components and all of the logic of a single page app happening in the browser, but the server is then mostly focused on vending an API. And so these are kind of the two dynamics that we're used to seeing most of the time. The dynamic that most of the time, if you talk to senior folks, there's some disagreement about this, but generally people try to avoid there being kind of a split the difference, where you have like the majority of the app is rendered on the server, and also a lot of that same stuff needs to get updated in JavaScript. And then you end up having duplication where you have, okay, this card, a profile card gets edited on the server. This team who maintains that piece of code tries to change it, but then the client has like duplicated logic about how does that get rendered and how does it get treated and how does it get updated. And those two things have to stay in sync. And so you have this like kind of split brain problem that teams generally try to avoid because it tends to slow you down. And so you end up getting a common advice to say either try to go more of the single page app side or try to keep more of the logic on the server is a common thing you'll hear. One of the sort of new things in the last few years that's really changed about how a lot of teams are architecting their apps is that there's some alternative ways of solving this split brain problem that don't just say, okay, we'll push all the logic one way or the other. One approach is what you would call in Rails is hotwire. You can use the same approach in a JavaScript environment as well, which is that the server does the rendering and the updating of the page both. So it's not just the initial page load, but then when you click on something in one of these hotwire architecture apps, the JavaScript might just say, hey, this profile thing needs to change, and the server will actually do the re-rendering and the updating. And then the JavaScript is still relatively minimal, a light amount of JavaScript on the page. The complexity is primarily on the server. Like I say, most popular in Rails app, but in theory, you can build this. And I've talked to teams that have built this with Node and JavaScript as well. So that's one way of doing things. But then the even newer, even more trendier, cool, or at least quote unquote cool way of doing things is they've invented this new thing called server-side rendering. I'm not sure if you heard about this in any of the frameworks. They do server-side rendering, where it's not like the server-side rendering we had in 1998 with CGI bin and Perl scripts. It's server-side rendering where they actually take the libraries and the functionality we have in our client libraries, so things like React or Svelte or things like that. And the server does the first pass of the rendering using that same, or more or less that same code, and then sends a like first pass render to the client, which then does quote unquote hydration, brings it to life, and then interaction continues from there. And so these two models are kind of like yin and yang, different approaches of trying to solve the same problem, which is saying we want to have an interactive, rich app that has also rapid loading, because the initial grunt work was done on the server instead of sending a megabyte of JavaScript that it has to load and process before anyone can see a single pixel. And these are sort of like two new approaches. And these are really cool approaches. There's some cases where these can be really big benefit to the way that you build application. User experience can be better. But they create yet another responsibility on us as developers, and another sort of piece in our puzzle in terms of putting together a toolkit of what we're trying to build with. And so when you think about what are the concerns of JavaScript frameworks that we're considering, we have, of course, like there's the components, and we have like for React and things like that. Apparently, it's actually my slide builds that are not working. So I'm just going to build all of this until it goes to the next slide and then roll back. Come on. How many builds did I have? I have that many. So if you're ever wondering, if you're giving a talk to 100 people and then Figma Slides decides to get confused in the way this has, you have to press forward 2 times the number of builds that you had on your slide and then backward. So in this case, that was 10 forwards and then 1 backward. We have the components, obviously, in our framework, but we also have a concern of routing. We have to worry about fetching data, potentially on the server as well as on client. We have a build process now. For most projects have a build process, which in some cases is getting very complicated, TypeScript. And now also we're adding maybe server rendering of your client components. This is a lot of stuff. This is a lot more than React does for you, for example. And so that's why in 2025, if you're building a new JavaScript project, you're probably not just looking at React or something like that. If you go to the React docs, they say this. If you want to build a new app or a website with React, we recommend starting with a framework. And for a lot of people are like, isn't React a framework? It's like, no, it's just a library. It's just a tiny bit of the insane complexity you need to build a web app in 2025, or at least that a lot of us think that we need. And so what do they mean when they say a framework? They're talking about, and they explicitly list out the idea of a meta framework, which is a sort of composition of different considerations for some of those things, like how do builds work, how does fetching work, how does routing work, composed into a sort of an entire solution, or quote unquote entire solution for building web apps. And in the React docs, they propose that you look at, if you choose that you want to use React, they would say use the React Router framework or use the Next.js framework. And so we have this rise, and those are just 2 of the many examples of meta frameworks out there. There's Nuxt, and there's all sorts of them there. And so that has given us, in the JavaScript community, the delight for even more frameworks to consider when we're deciding what we should build. And so that's great. And so that puts us in a situation where we get to, every time we start a project, we got to choose our fighter. Who's it going to be? Is it going to be analog? What's analog? I don't even know. TanStack looks cool. It's got like a cool logo. Like, it's chill. Let's go with that one. Let's see how that one plays. And then you're like 3 years into the project, and you're like, I regret everything. I declare bankruptcy. And so this is a situation that we end up in, and this has been true forever, and this is just kind of roughly the current state of it. How do we deal with this? There's 2 approaches in my mind. Number one is you can choose the thing that's cool. So there's this site called thestateofjs.com. I'm not sure if anyone's seen this. And they do surveys every year where you can see what the cool frameworks are. And so apparently React is the front-end framework that people use the most. It seems like 81% of people use that, so I guess that's the coolest. Except actually, now that you look at it, you can see like the green and red underlines. Like, people don't like React as much as people like Svelte. So like the people who use React don't like React as much as the people who use Svelte like Svelte. So I guess Svelte is the cool thing. But then people who don't use Svelte don't like Svelte. And is that because they have some reason, or they just haven't tried it? Let's dig deeper. Maybe let's figure out, instead of doing the one that's popular, let's do the one that people like. Well, luckily, State of JS has a tier list. You get S tier if 90% of the people who use your framework would choose it again. And so I guess Astro and SvelteKit, that's the things we should use now. Now, never mind that Astro is like actually not a fit for a lot of types of software. It's like more meant for like kind of like static site generation, creating more content-centric site, and Svelte would be more dynamic site. That's not on here anymore. Let's just go for whatever thing people like, and it's JavaScript. I guess it's all interchangeable, right? Of course, this is also all front-end stuff. None of this is talking about like, oh, what if you're building an API? Like, Fastify is on here, and so but that's a thing you can do. What did we learn from this? I don't know. Don't choose Gatsby, I guess. 27% of people who chose it are glad they did that. So maybe we learned that. And then, of course, like React and Next, which are the most commonly used things, people are like, it's fine, I guess. So you can choose things based by coolness, and like that's a thing that you can do. But of course, you also want to know how cool is changing over time. So you can get a two-dimensional graph. These are the meta frameworks. And so you can see Next.js was getting more and more popular. And then once it got popular, people are like, oh, maybe I don't like it anymore. And so over time, it's like, I don't know if it's because of things that they've done or if it's just people realizing like, oh, God, what is all in here? This is a very large framework. And then the smaller frameworks are all going up in usage. And inevitably, at some point, we will realize, oh, actually, we don't like these anymore. And they'll go to the left and we won't like them anymore. And then there's Gatsby. It's like kind of dinging around in the corner here. Poor Gatsby. So this is a way you can choose frameworks. And if you're building a side project, you're building something for fun, you're building for something for your own learning, this is an extremely valid way, like vibe-based. Like you look at TanStack and people on Reddit are like, it looks cool and it's got a cool logo. You can build something with that. That's a totally valid way to build things. But if you're building something that matters, you're building something that is a business, it is something that is mission critical, it's something that you're making a real bet on, then I would really encourage people to take the second path, which is maybe not entirely popular, but it's to choose boring technology. Yes, right? Boring technology does not mean bad technology. It doesn't mean outdated technology. It doesn't mean Java, NetBeans, or something like that, Fortran, right? It means choose something that is well understood and well maintained, and that your team is not going to be the most cutting edge team that is like the first people to hit some scaling bug or something like that. And so what would it mean in the world of JavaScript in 2025, maybe if we were to apply this idea of choose boring technology? Well, if you're old school and you've been around, oh, of course, this is my builds don't work. Oh man, this is going to be the worst slide for the builds not to work. Okay, I'm gonna have to press 17 times forward and then 1 time backwards, I think. Oh man. Oh no, back by 1. There we go. So here's a whole information dump. The idea is that if you have different mental models, right? So if you're like, let's just build an old school app the same way we would have built it 10 years ago, and you choose React and Express, that is not cool. Like nobody is going to be like, what a cool, oh man, tell me about that. But it's going to work, right? It's not going to inspire anyone, but it's going to let you focus. You're not going to have any security bug that no one else had, If you have a content-centric app, maybe just use Next. Like it's the most popular thing. Most of the startups are using it. Yeah, it has problems. Yeah, it locks you into Vercel. But it's not. You're going to be able to hire people to help you solve that problem. There's going to be an entire category of startups. The entire thing is like helping Next apps run on things other than Vercel in the future because there's like billions of dollars of Next apps being built today. You're not going to be the odd one out. If you're building something backend centric, you're building an API and you don't want to be so old school that you're still building an Express app in 2025, there's something that's like battle tested like Fastify or Nest, right? Rather than something that just got invented 5 minutes ago. If you object to Vercel, which is like a very valid thing to do for reasons, then maybe you go for like React Router, which is like the framework around React that like does not have any dependency on being deployed in Vercel. Or if you're a React objector, which is also a very reasonable thing in 2025, maybe you go for Svelte or Vue or one of the frameworks that have been around for a long time that fill in the same role that React does, but maybe doesn't have a decade and a half of weird virtual DOM stuff hanging off of it. My point with all of this is not definitely use these things here as a prescription. My point is when you're building something, if it's something that actually matters, to think about the problem you're actually trying to solve, the people you're actually trying to serve, the experience you're trying to create, and try to choose the most boring, well-understood thing that actually solves that problem so you can spend your time and attention and energy on the exciting thing, which is building something great. So thank you very much.